Hello and welcome to the Indeed Knowledge series, where we dive into looking at issues key to evidence-based evaluation and improving how we address preventing and countering violent extremism and radicalization. I have the great pleasure to be joined today by Kamala Chandrakirana. Kamala, it is wonderful to have you with us. For those who haven't met you before, Kamala is a prominent human rights activist that has decades of experience focusing also on gender equality. She served on the United Nations Human Rights Council working group addressing laws and practices that discriminate against women, and on the UNASCAP working group on women, peace, and security. In 2009, she co-founded Musawa, a global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. In Indonesia, she chaired the National Commission on Violence Against Women for 6 years and continues to advocate for human rights through various civil society organizations. She's also involved in Indonesia for Humanity, the Southeast Asia Women's Caucus on ASEAN, the Asia Pacific Women's Alliance on Peace and Security, and the Urgent Action Fund for Women's Human Rights. For 13 years, Kamala was also the coordinator of the Civil Society Coalition to advocate for survivors of gross human rights violations. Kamala's work champions justice, equality, and accountability, both locally and globally. Kamala, welcome. It is a pleasure and a privilege for us to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me, Kai. It's a privilege for me to be able to be part of your very important initiative.
Well, we're very glad to. We're looking forward to the conversation we're going to have. Now, Kamala, I first came across some of your work during a webinar that you had just a few weeks back, which was really focusing within the context of shift the power. And that's where I wanted to start. I was wondering if you could just help us to understand what is meant by that, shift the power.
Well, I think shift the power is a movement that is now gaining ground globally. And the reason I believe the reason why it's gaining ground is because it means something for different people and in many ways, in different ways. And the idea of a movement to shift the power resonates to me because of my keen awareness that even as I am, or we, me and my community has been struggling for peace, justice, and human rights for all in various conflict situations and deep-seated inequalities and polarization in society. We work, with our partners and with our donors, but there is a hierarchy in this space. Even though together we are working to address conflict, to bring peace, to bring justice, but there is a structural inequality in the space where we work, even though we have the same goals. And for us, the reason why the Shift the Power movement is so important is that finally we are able to find fellow travelers who recognize that there's a problem in this structural inequality, and that we have come together to speak of it, to bring it to the forth, to recognize that there is this even among us who are working for the same goals, and hopefully find the breakthroughs. So shift the power for me means address the power imbalances, the power inequality, even among all of us who are working for the same goals for peace, justice, and human rights and dignity for all.
Thank you so much for that, and focusing on that power inequality. and some of what is meant by shift to justice, and how to do that also in relations between organizations and donors in the field of evaluation and learning. It's very much what we're going to dive into together in this interview today. But before we do that, I'm wondering if you could take us through a bit your own personal journey. How did you get involved in this field? What has been your trajectory? And also, if you could, what is it that drives you? What has been the motivation, the why for you in being involved and in doing this work?
And you mean doing this work being the context of peace, conflict, and security, or evaluation in general? Because
I would go back. I would say doing this work in terms of what you have carried on for through your life, working for social justice, working for women's rights, working to address these critical issues that are affecting our societies and our world.
Yeah, well, it's it's a long story and necessarily so, but I won't spend so much time on it. But firstly, I have to recognize that it has to do with um, a journey of my nation as well, of Indonesia. My parents, I was born in a family that was part of the nationalist revolution during the decolonization process in the 40s after the Second World War. And so I grew up in a milieu, in my social environment, where I hear stories from my parents, from my aunts and uncles, about their struggle for independence and about why they were struggling for independence against the Dutch colonial power that was in power in Indonesia for 300 years. And the reason why they were part of the movement was to ensure justice and human rights for Indonesians. So I grew up in that kind of environment. But the big trigger that brought me into the issue, particularly of violence, and what I mean here is political violence, mass violence, is another historical moment in Indonesia's journey, which is we had 32 years of authoritarianism, starting in 1965, which began with mass killings. It was one of the biggest mass killings in Asia. That brought about a military dictatorship, basically. And in 1998, after the what's called the Asian financial crisis, the dictator in this, in our case, his name is Suharto. He was a general. Stepped down. And 1998 started what we call reformasi, a period of political reform. But what triggered that moment of political change was, aside from the economic crisis, was mass riots in Indonesia, which happened in the capital city where I live, Jakarta, as well as a few other cities around the country. And the riots were directed against the minority Chinese community. And I was at that time part of women's rights groups. And through that network, we learned that in the midst of the rioting, the burning of cars, houses, attacks on stores, there were incidences of rape against Indonesian Chinese women. And so I was involved in trying to provide a support system for the survivors at that time, as well as to carry out public education to the Indonesian public about why these riots were happening, why women were being targeted in the midst of this riot. So an outcome of that activism was an agreement with the new Indonesian president, who had a political reform agenda, to set up a national human rights mechanism for women to address violence against women. And so this was the commission that I was part of for 11 years. But what happened was, when we started our political reform, which is a process of democratization, when the structures of power under the previous regime was lifted, what happened was the conflicts and the tensions that existed in society that was repressed because of a repressive system suddenly, well, not suddenly, but there was also various political interests involved, broke out into violent conflicts around the country. So so I was shaped by the realities of conflict. And in Indonesia, the conflicts were diverse in different parts of the country. There were areas that were under military control, which was a legacy of the authoritarian regime. So we had what's called the military zones, areas in the country that was under the control of the military, where there was also freedom movements there. So there was this kind of conflict in Aceh, East Timor, and Papua, but there were also other parts of the country where the conflict was inter-ethnic and inter-religious. So communities where there was Christian and Muslim neighbors living together, it felt like it was all of a sudden, because no one expected it, broke out in communal conflict that killed. There was a point where we had 1.5 million displaced persons because of the various conflicts. So as I was part of building a national commission on violence against women. The type of violence that we were addressing was violence in the context of different types of armed conflicts and communal conflicts. So that shaped the way I carried out my agency and activism.
Kamala, thank you for sharing that with us and taking us through that journey of an extraordinarily painful and difficult and also very heroic time in your country. And you've had these decades of involvement in social activism and working for women's rights and working to address conflicts. And now you are involved with Indonesia for Humanity as a civil society resource organization. Can you tell us just a bit about the work of Indonesia for Humanity?
Yeah, just to continue on that journey. So, I was working basically on the ground, supporting community level organizing in the context of conflicts, but also supporting and leading advocacy policy changes, and that for about 15 years. And after my term ended at the commission, I felt that there was a problem in the way and I consider myself an activist, so in the way activism existed, i.e. this overdependence on big international donors, and that I had already felt at that time that this was a structural issue and a problem that no one is in a position to address, because everyone is trying to get the job done. There was the opportunity to join Indonesia for Humanity, which already existed since the final years of our authoritarian regime, and Indonesia for Humanity has a very specific role within civil society in Indonesia, which is to provide small grants to grassroots activists and social change activists around the country. And I felt that I need to move out of the front lines and start working in the context of a support system to those on the front lines. And so that's why I decided that Indonesia for Humanity would be the right place for me to do that, given my reflections. And of course, that was not the only thing I did, but we're talking about now Indonesia for Humanity. So what is this organization? It's an organization that was set up in 1995. So this was before the reform process started in Indonesia. It was during the latter years of the authoritarian regime, and it was set up as by civil society to support civil society and to support the pro-democracy movement, including to support political prisoners who had been released from prison and had to start their new life in public, where stigma was still very, very strong. And so Indonesia for Humanity calls itself a civil society resource organization. It's a grant. The function is a grant making, but we consider ourselves a resource organization. We are our area of concern is about resourcing civil society, but not through big funds, because that is not something, that is not who we are. We have our main asset is our network. It's not money. We have very little money, and we can only give small grants, and we only wanted small grants because we wanted to support organizations that did not have access to big donors. We wanted to support those who are working, in the grassroots, and even sometimes don't even have a legal identity. So that's what it does. It has 4 different funds for women survivors of violence, funds for survivors of gross human rights violations, a fund for climate justice, and then a 4th one on supporting cultural movement for diversity, for respecting diversity. And basically, we consider ourselves as part of the ecosystem of civil society. We position ourselves not as donors, but as, again, an organization in the ecosystem of civil society that focuses on resourcing. So we position ourselves as in an egalitarian relationship with the grantees. We're not bigger, we're not richer, we're not smarter than our grantees. We are all just out there trying to make things work. So that's basically the positioning that Indonesia for Humanity holds.
So that's a very different type of position than a lot of what you were mentioning also earlier, the nature of the relationship between large donors and often local or national civil society organizations. So yourself more a resource organization together with organizations in your community, in your country. And then how did evaluation become part of this picture?
Yes. So, we're giving small grants, and they're quite small, but the organization Indonesia for Humanity has a very big ambition. It wants to support the self-reliance and sustainability of social movements, because we are part of the social movement, and we want to make sure that we are able to stay relevant, to stay to have a long life, because our goal of justice for all and human rights for all is a very long-term agenda. Social transformation doesn't happen in project cycles; it happens in life cycles. And so we as we were giving these grants, we said we want to be able to know how we contribute in real terms. Even though with small funds, we believe that what we give is meaningful, but we don't know, because we don't have monitoring evaluation system. Now, we've had experience receiving large grants from big donors that then has an allocation of funds for monitoring evaluation. But the monitoring and evaluation under that context requires following the model of monitoring evaluation of our donor, and which can only be carried out or implemented by people who are experts in monitoring evaluation. And monitoring evaluation has become its own industry, producing its own experts, and in a way has produced its own economy. But we, as a small civil society organization, we don't fit there. Firstly, because we don't frame our work in a scale that the big donors do. And secondly, we do not have the resources to access the expertise, because the experts basically have, again, its own economy. There's rates, billing rates and whatnot. And that's just totally beyond our reach. But we still need to find a way to understand how we are impacting the shared agenda of social transformation. So we said, okay, we need to find our own way. How can we do it? And we don't want to do it simply by saying, let's do a cheap version of the big monitoring evaluation that the big donors are doing and paying for. We don't want to make a cheap version or small version of that. We want to make something that is genuinely responding to our need and our context. And so what we did was we started a few kind of a series of roundtable discussions with different people from within the movement, who are also, I would say, they are kind of public intellectuals within civil society, who are thinking about social movements, who are anxious about, are we on the right track? Are we doing things the right way? So we brought in together just different people to start just talking about how could we do this? What's important, And out of that series of roundtable, we finally came up with a methodology that we call pemaknaan, which is really focusing on meaning and not on measuring, how many people have we affected in terms of how many lives have we affected, how many people have changed the way they work or have been empowered, or how many parts of the country are, which is very quantitative. And the big kind of monitoring evaluation under the context of large projects require or assumes that significance is a function of quantity. Significance of the work is a function of quantity. And I understand that, Indonesia is a huge country. It's 270 million people. And of course, if you want to have an impact, there's got to be some numbers part of it. But we are a small organization by choice. We work at a small scale by choice, not because we cannot be big, because we believe in small scale work. But the small scale work needs to add up to something, and we need to ensure that our contribution to that process is genuinely meaningful. So for us, meaningfulness becomes the central goal of the process of, it's not even an evaluation. It really is to open the space in which our partners, our local partners, have a companion who can reflect together, not on the project that we funded, but on their journey to push for social transformation. So when we do our pemaknaan, when we do our method, we don't come like at the end of or at the middle of the grant. We come after. So there's no consequence in terms of whether we're going to fund you again or not, because some of the system in the big donors is that your evaluation will determine whether you will get another grant or something. For us, we come after everything is done, and we don't ask about what we funded. We ask about your journey, your journey, your mission. What is the journey? What are the challenges? And how do you envision or start thinking about the forward steps or the future of the journey? Because our assumption is, even though we are working with small organizations at grassroots level, their goals are still to transform society, not just to build a bridge or to help one survivor so that she can get legal assistance for her case, and not just that, but that the organizations we support want to change the social system, the cultural system, the economic, and these are long-term agendas. So we're interested in the journey, not in the activities.
You've spoken of Pamaknan as a method of collective learning, and you've spoken about grounding the learning journey in communities of practice. Can you share with us a bit how that's done and what that looks like in practice? What are the approaches you take when engaging and facilitating this learning journey?
Yeah. Well, firstly, before how is why, because why did it become important for us to ground the learning journey? Is because the monitoring evaluation system, the conventional ones, are carried out by experts with focus on quantity. Large quantities equals significant impact and value. And they are usually the experience of, and this, now I'm referring to not just my experience in Indonesia for Humanity, but in the 15 years prior and 20 years prior, where I was actually on the ground working in conflict situations. And where when we are trying to report or what is it, communicate the value of our work, we had to just do acrobats to provide some quantity value to what we're doing, whereas that's actually not quantity influencing so many 50,000 or 100,000 or was not our goal, but it is something that's important for the donor. So we try to, how do we calculate these things, and the demand to formulate and shape and articulate and convey our value in a quantified way actually takes away from what we believe to be the work. And that's why, I'm saying these conventional, and I'm not saying all of them, but many of these conventional monitoring evaluation systems actually make us lose lose our sense of self, because we're forced to say what we're doing and what's important is something that actually isn't important for us. So it feels like almost artificial.
So
it feels,
and it's oriented towards the needs of the donor and a system coming in from the outside, not to the needs of those who are doing the work or necessarily to the actual context and what you're trying to do in that work.
Yeah. And so that's one thing. The other is that system, this conventional monitoring evaluation system, values only success. The only way we are asked to and can convey our work is by saying it's a success. But if you're a person who's working on the ground, most of your experience is about failure. Most of your experience is about, we tried going this way, we got stuck, we have to figure out somewhere, another way. Okay, let's try. Nothing is linear. Everything is complex. The donor, oftentimes, I'm sure we're all very familiar with the log frame, with what are the assumptions and all. Our assumptions have to change almost, very often. And so that's another kind of, it's initially for the quantification, it feels artificial and not really representing what we're doing and what's meaningful for us. But it's also on the success is the only thing that's being valued. And yet, our experience is often with tears and frustration and just depression sometimes. But that cannot be part of the story, because if you say anything that shows that something didn't work, or we went the wrong way and we have to go, then we may not get any more support, and that also will have an implication for a perception that we don't know how to do our work. But working, and then so it will be a conclusion about the whole organization's credibility and sense of are they doing the work right? But no one knows how to do this work right. It's always it's just very complex. So complexity and failure is such a reality, and yet that is unrecognized, and not just unrecognized, impossible for us to be speaking the truth, because that is the truth. And so, sometimes I feel, what are we doing here? Telling all these things, whereas we know what happened was not like this. It was not this simple. It was not this linear, and it was not a full success. Of course, we can frame things as success, but so anyway, so that kind of the other thing that is an issue is that usually when you have evaluators, and particularly evaluators, independent evaluators being brought in from the headquarters and whatever, the report will be written in a language that we don't understand. So when there's all this data being collected and all this analysis being made by experts who are being, high-paid experts, producing a report of, maybe 50 pages or what, that we do not understand and we have no access to. Even if we get a copy, it goes into because even the questions that were asked were not the questions that resonated to us. So that's why, in the last time we met, I was saying that these conventional monitoring evaluation system methodologies are reductionist, are extractive, and traumatic. And traumatic is not my word. It's the word of my colleague who was part of our Pamaknaan process. And when I was explaining to her what our methodology would be, she almost made a sigh of relief. Said, "Oh, you mean we can just see what's happening and engage based on what we think is important, and we don't have to do all these matrices and quantifying." And she said, because that work is so traumatic, just to produce something that doesn't represent what we are genuinely facing, doing, and experiencing. Anyway, so that's the reason.
I was giving a training program recently, just a few weeks ago, and I was looking at what can be some of the different roles that evaluators take on. And one of the roles that I put was therapeutic. And it was one that most in the room had not seen before. But what I was reflecting is, as you shared, so much of this work can be deeply challenging. It's often working on issues that are very difficult, often issues of conflict, issues that are affecting people's lives, people's families, and doing the work very often with limited resources and under challenging conditions. And a good evaluation, healthily done, can sometimes help to provide a space where people can process and make sense of and be able to understand, to find or to explore meaning, as you said. Whereas we were also reflecting, as you've shared, and you used reductionist and extractive, a lot of the practice of what is accepted and considered to be, how evaluation is done and good practice in evaluation, it is often very extractive. It comes in from the outside. It's imposed. It creates stress and that perception, that reality of risk, because, as you said, the focus is only on being able to put forward and identify success. And if shortcoming or challenge or difficulty is identified, it's as a negative for the organization. It's not understanding maybe the incredible efforts and the context in which it was happening, but it simply identifies it as a failure, a flaw, a deficiency in it. And when you were speaking about reports being written in a different language, even if it's in the same national language, it's often written in a way that it's simply not accessible. It's not meant for people to be able to read it. And there really is so little learning that is then enabled in that process because it is one that's done from above. And as you were also sharing, and this is something we've looked at a lot, so often even the questions which an evaluation engages with miss the point entirely because they're written by experts, so-called, who may not know the context and may come in with their particular ideology or framing or how they look at issues. And we've identified that so much of what is called evaluation is actually simply the asserting the prejudices of the evaluator or the perceptions that they have even before they come in to do the evaluation. They're not necessarily processes that really help us to understand and to learn what's happening, what's working, what isn't working, but also how and why to be able to help us in that effort to really achieve meaningful impact in the context and the conditions we're working in.
Yeah. And, after decades of this kind of practice, the civil society organization or grantees also learn that language and learn, and I've seen spaces where there's monitoring evaluation and people are just glazed and they just, answer the way that they think they are expected to answer, just to go through this as a procedure, as a procedural thing in order to go to the next step, which is to get the next grant. So, it becomes even less meaningful because the evaluator comes in, with their biases, and the evaluated is just producing what they think they want to hear. And then is this truly a productive space? Because there is no genuine conversation that is happening. So, part of what we're also seeing in just introducing a different paradigm for, and we don't even call it monitoring evaluation, but it's meant to understand impact, which I believe is part of the objective of monitoring evaluation. I mean, part of it, what we're seeing also is that some of us have to unlearn. We have to unlearn these practices that have become ingrained in the way we participate in a process of reviewing impact. So, yeah, I mean, this is why we really wanted to find a totally different way, a very different space and modality and goal. And so that's why the goal is a learning goal, a learning about how social transformation happens through the experience of our partners on the ground. And one of the key distinctive characteristics or the key element of pemaknaan that makes it paradigmatically different from monitoring evaluation is what we say as a principle, one of the key principles in pemaknaan, which is celebrating subjectivity. So we are starting not from objectivity. Quantification is about making things more objective, measurable, comparable, and we're not going to be into comparability, reliability, all these statistics, numbers, scales, and whatnot. we are creating space on the basis of respecting the subjectivity of everyone involved, from subjectivity of the our partner organization and the subjectivity of the person who is doing the pemaknaan. We call them pemakna. So pemaknaan comes from the root word makna. Makna means meaning. And so, and putting per in front of makna is the person who is trying to produce meaning. So pemakna is this. So we don't call evaluator. We don't call the person an evaluator. We call the person a pemakna. It's an invented word. It's not a word that is already common in Indonesia. And so in that sense, we are also producing new vocabulary. So it's not just about how we do it, it's like how we even speak of it, what a language we're trying to create with distinctiveness and create space simply through the language, the vocabulary, the word that we are using. And it's very interesting because we've been doing this pemaknaan three rounds of it over the last 5 years. And when we tell people about pemaknaan, Indonesians who of course obviously know the language, for them it's like, oh yes, of course, it's like, yes, of course, we want to be part of this. It's very interesting because even the word has already made an impact. But anyway, so what do we mean?
That's so powerful also, just to hold on that for a moment, because language is power. And so often evaluation is done in languages that are foreign for people. And again, that can be both in terms of the actual language we're speaking, but as well as the semantics and the syntax and the language of experts and professionals that engage with it. And it is taking people out of their space and out of their culture to something that is often artificial and foreign. Whereas here you have created language of meaning from within your own context and culture that people can resonate and connect with and understand.
And so what we're finding out is language is power, but it is also space. Language can create space.
And can create inclusion or exclusion as well.
Yeah, that has a spirit. When you say meaning, it's about connectedness to who you are and where you're going, and has a spirit. And so it's totally not the objective, it's just a totally different animal in the ecosystem. And so what does it mean when we celebrate subjectivity? It means that we, as Indonesia for Humanity, who's managing this, we have to understand our partner organization. And one of the things we do, first thing, is to ask them first, are you interested in going through a learning process, a collective learning process with us? So first they have to, because we don't do it, and it's different from the, also a difference with the monitoring evaluation where it's everyone, all the grantees get reviewed. In this case, we ask our partners first, do you want to be in this collective learning space together with us? That's called the pemaknaan. So they say yes. Then we ask, what would you like to learn? What is your learning need? So we need to understand that. And then we need to find the right person that would be able to speak to the learning needs of that organization. And finding the right person doesn't necessarily mean that they come from the same field, because part of, and this is part of our reading as part of civil society, is that we need to be speaking across sectors. We cannot just speak among ourselves. So an example is an organization, one of our partner organizations that work with women survivors of armed conflict, and was dealing with very traumatized communities. And they've been doing many things. They've existed for 20 years, but they're still having challenges because they said the community still cannot really speak about this. And so we thought, so what would you need? What kind of new perspective do you want? So we ended up finding a novelist, somebody who is an author of historical fiction or historical novels, who himself comes from the conflict area and is looking at cultural space and cultural means of or culture as an element, not just about going to the courts to get justice or going to getting trauma healing or counseling or economic empowerment, but culture. So with the idea that hopefully there will be an interesting dialogue that happens between them. So it requires us to find the right person. And that's why subjectivity, it's all about, and it requires us to understand who's out there that has the right kind of life journey that would be meaningful, or that would allow for a good conversation with our partner. So celebrating subjectivity in that sense, and subjectivity because context matters. And so getting people who understand context, so that you don't have to begin by explaining context and then that person has to understand the context and then understand what you're doing, but somebody who already understands context, you immediately go into a deeper level of conversation. And so that's part of kind of why subjectivity for us becomes important. What's the consequence of that is that the product, we don't call it a report, we call it notes from the Pamakna. And the product is also a reflection of the subjectivity of the Pamakna. So you have reports, I call them reports now, that the novelist, for example, is a series of stories, that reads like reading short stories. But then you have somebody else who's another Pamakna reviewing another organization, and the challenge for them is more kind of organization, sustainability of the organization and the movement. And so the kind of report produced from that is very much focused on the organization, and it's story about the life journey of organizations and how do you regenerate and all that. So I'll give you an example of the titles, just coming from the title. So, for example, the Pamakna who worked with our partner in this conflict, post-conflict area, the title of his report is Victims, Exclusion, and Ghosts, because ghosts were part of the way the trauma was being articulated. And so, you can imagine monitoring evaluation reports with the titles of the project, and this is like victims, exclusion, and ghosts. And then another one, which is for our local partner in a district where there is mining, gold mining, and it's about addressing violence against women. The title of the report from that is Magma Behind the Gold Mountain. So that person, the Pamakna, was trying to engage our local partner about the structural causes of violence against women in that district, which is connected to the kind of extractive economy that is being developed there. And so the title is about, the title is interesting, Magma Behind the Gold Mountain. And so, it's, for me, that kind of subjectivity is itself such a valuable thing, that we're able to capture what their reflections have been in very different ways. And hopefully, this is our hope, and of course we need to review our method continuously as well, that hopefully that method that is based on the subjectivity of the Pamakna and the subjectivity of the dialogue, that also becomes something that is useful for our partner organization, because it's something very much built out of that dialogue with them.
It sounds like an incredibly deep and rich journey, and a process that gives space to culture, to context, to meaning in ways that fit for the learning of those who are involved in doing the work.
And we have another level of learning. So actually it's multiple levels of learning, because there's the learning that comes bilaterally between the Pamakna and our partner. And then, because every round we have several happening at one time. So at any one time we have 4 or 5 Pamakna. So we also convene a discussion among the Pamakna, among the people who are doing the dialogues. So they are learning from each other too, based on what they're finding. And we're learning from that too. And after this, we actually extract critical issues that arise from the process as a topic of discussion with our network. So the learning goes from bilateral with the local, across the Pamakna, or whose role is to facilitate the dialogue, to initiate the dialogue. And then we take it to a next level, which is talking about strategic issues that should be addressed by the movement as a whole, not on a, and we're not talking about what happened to this organization, or it's not going to be, the discussion is not about our local partner. But it is about an issue that has arisen out of that dialogue, that requires the attention of the collectivity, because it is not, we select that issue because we believe that it reflects a problem that is bigger than a problem of one single organization, but it is a problem that we believe, again. So we, as the facilitator of the process, also express our subjectivity in terms of identifying what issue is arising that requires a conversation in a larger community of practice. So it's multiple levels of learning, and all of it is through a process of really grounded in our respective journeys and perspectives.
Kamala, you've spoken about the development of Pamatnan as a journey in part responding to how evaluation is often being done at the moment and the reductionist and the extractive and other aspects of it. Now that you have had this journey over 5 years and three different rounds, as you were saying, what would you like to see learned in terms of from the broader global field of engaging with evaluation and how this work is done? What would you like to see, or what do you feel needs to be changed?
Well, two things, I guess. One is, I mean, what I hope that this conversation and others like this can do is to build our confidence that we can and should find our own path that responds to real needs for ourselves, even though our work is so dependent on international support. We cannot, it is too high a price to lose ourselves in that process. We have to feel, and hopefully we will feel confident, yes, we can forge our own pathway. It's not easy because there's no funding for it. We're doing this because it's not recognized. And so that's the other thing is, I mean, hopefully if there's more and more of us who are trying out new things, then there's some recognition that there's not just one way or one paradigm to establish impact and relevance, that there are multiple ways, and that there are contextualized ways that are responsive to particular environments and situations and interests, and that that if there's that recognition, there needs to be support for organizations to find their own way. It's not, and we're not saying that this is an alternative to the monitoring evaluation that's happening. We're not saying that, because we know we can never go big scale. Our space, we have a different niche, we have a different purpose, we have a different modality, and that, you know, it's that to have this kind of niche and space is important, even for the big donors who are funding at a big scale. And because to tell you the truth, those big monitoring evaluations have no meaning for us. They are just procedural. They're a procedural process that has not really made an impact on us, other than how to play the game so we can continue to be funded. But that's not all of us want to play that game.
And in many ways, they have no meaning for truthfully understanding what has happened, how it affects people, how we can learn from it to be able to do more to achieve real justice and real peace, or reduce violence, or the impacts we're working for. And they contribute so little or almost nothing to learning, because it's a procedural, functional process. It's done to do the evaluation, goes into the agencies, but it so often doesn't feed out to the field. And when you're looking at just a numbers-based approach, there's so much that can be understood, so much that can be learned that is missed from just looking at a quantifiable results, which, as we know and as you've shared, often come from organizations trying to fit or squeeze or communicate what they're doing in the way the donor wants to hear, but doesn't necessarily reflect the authenticity on the ground. Kamala.
And that's why, sorry, go
No,
ahead.
please.
No, when I was reading Barry Knight and Dana Dawn's piece on measuring what matters, they say they use a term upward accountability. And so, and you know, from what our conversation now, I mean, we see that there's a price we have to pay for this upward accountability. And the Pamaknaan, the approach that we're doing, is our way to be for accountability to the community, to our own community of practice. And that it's accountability for ourselves too, that we are genuinely doing something meaningful, that we're how do we, because when we talk to our Pamaknaan, ask difficult questions. They're not there just to, oh, you're doing such a great job. Of course, we want affirmation, because sometimes, and I'm sure working in constant crisis, you achieve something and then you just, okay, we did that. The next challenge is that we don't take time to recognize our achievements, to say, wow, that was really a job well done, and that, let's celebrate that for a while. I mean, so affirmation is important, particularly when you're working in very, very complex, difficult situations where the problems, the tensions are long-term, deep-seated. You have to give that space to yourself. So part of the Pamaknaan dialogue is about affirmation, but it's also about asking critical and difficult questions, because we want this to be a moment. We want this to be a moment for everyone to reflect and think about how to move forward. So yeah, it's we want to understand how we impact and to ensure that we continue to be relevant. But in order for us to do that, we have to do it in a way that is meaningful for us. We can't achieve that by using measures and objectives and interests that are not ours. That is what is at stake. And that's why it's a matter of accountability to ourselves and to our community.
Taking the time to acknowledge and to celebrate achievements, taking the time to create spaces to reflect, and also to be able to understand sorrow and loss and difficulties and challenges in ways that help to find meaning for people working on very difficult issues and difficult circumstances. Kamala, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you for an inspiring and continuing lifetime of standing up for justice, for women's rights, and for peace. The innovation which you're doing and the innovation you're calling for, part of that process of helping us to find practices and processes of evaluation, of meaning, of learning, which are authentic and which can actually contribute to helping us to understand the change that we're trying to achieve and how to do it. Thank you very much.